what is a doppelganger?
Yeah. So, a doppelganger and, folklore is, like you see the person who, seems to be completely identical to you, and like you're seeing them as a sign that you're about to die, that kind of thing. And the sort of opening gimmick of the book is she's talking about how many, many times over the years she has been mixed up with Naomi Wolf. In fact, she has this really funny story about being at like a bathroom near like Zuccotti Park when the Occupy Wall Street protests are going on. And she hears these two women at the SIG talking about like this ridiculous shit that Naomi Klein just said. And she said she felt like she'd regressed to high school, the mean girls, are talking about her, in the bathroom. And then she realizes as she was listening to them that they're actually thinking about Naomi Wolf, because very similarly to what you were saying about the other podcast in question, there are all of these sort of zany similarities that, beyond having this first name that I guess is just uncommon enough. So, that they're both, Jewish women with, brown hair and this and that. And they had to, she lists off a bunch of these things. At one point, she was reading an art, like after she'd already started to get kind of fixated on this, she was reading this article about Wolf that casually mentioned that Wolf's boyfriend was a film producer named Avi, and Klein's husband is a film producer named Avi. So
insane, though.
Yeah, no, exactly right. So there are a bunch of these sort of strange, superficial coincidences, on top of which, again, I think the name is just uncommon enough that if you're one of the two most prominent Naomis who does like political commentary in English, then you're probably going to get mixed up with each other a bit. So that's kind of the opening gimmick. And I will say, when I first heard about this book, it was at the Socialism Conference last August in Chicago, and Klein was doing a presentation on it. And I was going to meet a friend there, and my friend told me later at the hotel bar that he actually they had actually left early on because he thought that this whole sort of premise was kind of gimmicky and ridiculous, which I get. But I think that it's really being used as this kind of literary device to explore something way more interesting, which is about the difference between Klein and what she stands for, and Naomi Wolf and what she stands for, and then, what that says about the existence of, as you're talking about in your opening monologue, this political current that in some ways feels like a doppelganger of the left as a whole, right? So Naomi Wolf, started out as sort of the mainstreamiest of mainstream feminists. She wrote about, unfair beauty standards and things like that. She, in fact, in 2000, she was a consultant for the Gore Lieberman campaign. And then by like the Occupy Wall Street era, she had this moment where she was drifting towards a more much more leftish oppositional stance. She liked Occupy Wall Street. She liked Julian Assange. She, even then, there were signs of what was to come, because she had a bit of a conspiratorial approach to the whole thing. The United States was always like teetering on the edge of fascism, it was about to become a police state. As there were crackdowns on Occupy and whatnot. And then when COVID, well, I should also say that, I think a crucial part of this story is that Wolf burns up a lot of her mainstream credibility because she wrote a book where she made like a really, really basic error in research that was exposed in just like a way that no matter how much you hate Naomi Wolf, like I find I can't like I've listened to the clip a couple times and it's just painful that like in a radio interview she realized that she'd made this like very, very basic mistake, like as the interviewer is correcting her, that like there's this phrase "death recorded" that means that she was in like these old records that Wolf was assuming meant that the person had been executed, but just sort of due to the quirks of English law in this era, it actually meant that they'd been, they'd been pardoned from execution. And so like, that's the whole premise of the book. And it's just, again, it's incredibly painful to listen to. I think she became a bit of a laughingstock because of that. And then she'd always had this conspiratorial bent. I also think that even during Wolf's leftist phase, let's say in the early 2010s, she never really had much of a material analysis of the world around her. I think that, there was some sort of vague anti-elite kinds of sentiments, and, governments can be bad and scary, and that's kind of about it, right?
Would you agree that a lot of people during that time kind of also have that same quote unquote leftist bend, especially when we talk about the Occupy moment, which is a reason why I don't really posit that as the beginnings of something, because it's just so all over the place. And so many of those people do fall into the Alex Jones camp of conspiratorial thinking, anti-vaccination. And I'm not talking about COVID. I'm talking about like measles and mumps.
Right.
There's a lot of anarchist thinking. Socialism is still not really a word that's being uttered the way it's uttered in 2015, 2016.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, look, there is, I'm sorry, I was just hesitating as I was starting to say this sentence because, I don't want to, there's at least one person I could think of from real life who has embodied this, who I probably shouldn't say, but like, there's a real like crunchy to Q pipeline, right? Like,
yes.
I mean, yeah, like if you like back in 2000, like the late 2000s, early 2010s, anti-vax stuff was largely left coded because that was a hippie thing, right? And in fact, if you go back to like 2008, there are moments on the campaign trail when both Hillary and Obama, neither of them endorsed any of that stuff, but like they pandered to it in a way that's kind of jarring to read some of the quotes now. Because, they're like, oh, well, there are legitimate questions here, please vote for me. And yeah, I think that what I've just finished describing with regard to Wolf is certainly not unique to her. And it's not even unique. I take this is your point, right? It's not even unique to people who ended up going Wolf's way, right? So like in some sense, what I just said would be, my critique of somebody like Glenn Greenwald, who I think is like 1,000 times smarter than Naomi Wolf, but I think has some of the same problems. That there's this sort of generic anti-elite kind of sentiment that's not, tied to material analysis, so it can go off in some pretty wild directions. And yeah, I think, yes, please.
Would you call this in your paper, you write about diagonalism, and I actually ended up looking up more things about diagonalism because that was the first time I'd actually heard that term. You use diagonalism to describe a form of anti-establishment radicalism. I think that's what you're getting at now.
Yep.
Can you really explain what that anti-establishment radicalism is and how it manifests in politics, and how does diagonalism mimic leftist rhetoric while serving fundamentally different political goals. And I think this is the most important part about apparently Klein's book and this idea of diagonalism, because I do see it kind of infecting parts of the area that we live in this leftist media space.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, diagonalism is a term that that Klein uses. I'm not sure about its prehistory before a book, but that she uses to talk about basically the sort of place that Naomi Wolf, her doppelganger, ended up going when the pandemic started, and she reacted to that in ways that channeled all of her worst instincts. The conspiracism, certainly, at the core of it, and I think in combination with that, she'd already become something of a laughingstock. I think her conspiracism about COVID, which alienated, whatever friends that she had left of center. And I think I think there's also just an interpersonal aspect to the dynamic here that happens in, many such cases, which is that once your old friends won't talk to you anymore, you'll hang out with whoever will still have you, and little by little, humans being what they are, you'll start to be influenced by some of their views, and so in Wolf's case, that's like Steve Bannon, who Wolf, like, over the this time period, just became a fixture on Bannon's podcast, The War Room. And when you're looking at the sort of populism that Wolf and Bannon came to represent, which has this branding that's very like, oh, this isn't ideological, or it's like cross-ideological or something like that, then this is what she's thinking about when she uses the term diagonalism. So things that, as you said in your opening monologue, squinted at just the right angle, look like the themes of the left. So, it's anti-war if you're incredibly selective about what wars you're talking about, right? Like Trump, ripping up the Iran deal and assassinating Soleimani and doubling the rate of drone strikes in Yemen. None of that seems to count against him, and certainly don't get these guys started on China. But yeah, but they sound anti-war when the context is restricted to Ukraine. They, again, they have this surface hostility to big tech, depending on which big tech you're talking about. And there are even some of the like really nonsensical things they spout have this sense where they sort of feel like distorted echoes of things that a leftist might say. So, for example, one of Naomi Klein's books is called The Shock Doctrine, and it's about how, emergencies are, real or imagined, are used to cram unpopular, neoliberal policies down the throats of the population. And then when you look at Wolf's plandemic stuff, it sounds a bit like that. It sounds like this really stupid version of that, rather than, officials sort of fumbling in the dark, trying to respond to an unprecedented public health crisis in whatever way it made sense with the constantly changing information they had. This was this plan to institute this authoritarian social control, which, by the way, nobody who says stuff like this is, it's like, I really want an update from some of these people now, right? Like, oh yeah, how we've all had to have, vaccine passports for the last 4 years, that very real thing that's happened.
Yeah.
Whatever. But it's kind of like how, the deep state faked Sandy Hook, but they couldn't even get any gun control legislation, out of control.
They just did it to do it to just prove a point.
I guess, yeah. So yeah, I mean, this is the kind of thing that she's thinking of when she talks about political diagonalism, or this kind of current being like a collective doppelganger of the left. And before getting to where my criticism of the book comes in, I mean, I really think it's worth highlighting that Klein also says some smart things about how the mistakes of the left create an opening for this stuff. That she talks about how oftentimes there's this sort of reactive thing that happens, that when they have touched an issue, now it's like toxic, and we can't talk about it anymore. And so yeah, like there is this very stupid conspiracies about vaccine passports, for example, but there is within that there's this germ of a real issue about tech surveillance, for example, that oftentimes people are very dismissive of, because I think we all know the way that in the era of nonstop online political discourse, I think we know that the way a lot of that works, the rules say that whatever the people who most annoy you are hot and bothered about at any given moment. Yeah, exactly, right. I mean, that's
is this why you think diagonalist movements are able to attract followers who might traditionally align with leftist ideals, like outside of, like, how do you think Steve Bannon and his ilk are able to gain a certain amount of traction in a certain, I would say, I guess, anti-establishment space in the left? We definitely know that there's shows that are maybe a little more Bannon friendly. How do you think that rhetoric is able to capture people that might otherwise kind of espouse lefty ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly, and I know that when you start listing the stuff off, people are like, well, that's not a leftist, that's actually a right winger. It's like, yeah, okay, but like, I think you're missing my larger point, right? And who counts as a true whatever is not, I think, really the essence of the issue here. But like you look at how somebody like Jimmy Dore could, go from, I don't know, like Bernie Sanders is a sellout to Tucker Carlson is making some good points. So the first is sort of framed as a missive from the far left, and then the other sort of doesn't really make sense, with that, right? It's like, oh, Bernie didn't fight hard enough in the right ways for Medicare for all, but Tucker never pretended he supported that. So it's kind of nonsensical on its face, but I think these dynamics are part of the answer to that. That I think that it is the case that part of what's going on here is, if certain kinds of complaints or themes resonate with you, if maybe the people who annoy you the most are mainstream liberals, and you see these people who sort of have very anti-establishment optics, who are opposing those guys, and then the thing that's supposed to be a left alternative isn't really speaking to your concerns in a certain way, then I think that's definitely part of the story. But I will say, and this does bring us into, my critique of Klein, that I think that there are a lot of other ways that that the left doesn't present a appealing alternative. So I think that there's, I mean, like just to go to kind of the main point of criticism, I think that a lot of leftism, as we know it right now, is this sort of weird cocktail of, old timey socialist politics and this kind of liberal identitarianism that is, that's incredibly alienated. That that in a certain sense is incredibly alienating by design. Because the I think that it really caters to this kind of elite taste for self-mortification, for the sort of pride you take from having gone on this kind of moral vision quest to become a better person and an ally and all of that stuff. And I think I think that ultimately, if we are in a situation where not only sort of the libs, but also people who are supposed to be a left alternative to the libs are ultimately telling people, oh, you are like, you are innately part of this oppressor category, that you, at best, you can undergo this like kind of moral reformation and, become a good ally, always listening, always learning, always worrying that your privilege will be peeking through and distorting your judgments. Then, I think that's not a very appealing message. And then when, somebody like Steve Bannon comes along and says you're a hardworking, salt of the earth American, who's being screwed over by the globalists, like that second one is much more appealing.
Do you think this has, excuse me, something to do with a kind of end of history moment that really starts, of course, in the 90s as the internet, there's a burgeoning internet, and people like Bill Clinton, before he leaves office, is talking about, we have this third way, because the left-right binary in which you see the world is antiquated. And there's a third way to see the world. Does it feel like this diagonalism is kind of glomming on to these ideas?
Yeah, it's a right-wing third way.
Right? Yeah. Like a right, a further right, a further right third way.
Yeah. No, I think there's probably something to that. That, and I think I think it also speaks to the superficiality of all of this stuff, that there is that interesting echo, with Clintonism and Blairism in all of this, right? Because even though the pitch is the opposite, right? So in the sort of classic, Clinton, Blair, I don't know, throw in Ehud Barak. I think Carville helped elect him too. That kind of third way is ultimately this kind of technocratic managerial sort of liberalism, like very much like on its face. It's that, right? That if you like watch old episodes of The West Wing, right, which are, as a little time capsule of this era, so much of that show is about people patting themselves on the back about being like experts who are smarter than normal people. And, like if you think about like when Hillary Clinton ran for president in 2016, they just repeated over and over and over again, oh, she's the most qualified person to have ever run for president, as if this is this kind of technocratic job interview rather than having anything to do with clashing ideology, never mind clashing material interests. So that on the surface is exactly the opposite of the sort of Bannonite, populism where you say, oh, we represent the forgotten people, people who, JD Vance said in his best line in his RNC speech, that our jobs were sent overseas and our children were sent off to war, which, apart from that, our Mr. Venture Capitalist who had summer break with grandma in Appalachia, putting that aside, right? It's accurate enough as far as it goes. But those are two sort of different rhetorical strains, but ultimately, despite this like big divergence in the rhetoric that's used to sell them, these are both still claims that, oh, look, the sort of old way of thinking about politics where, you have, clashes about how to distribute resources that, that pit, workers against capitalists, in the sort of, purist version of that, critique, or, some watered down like New Deal populist version of that. That's outdated. That's yesterday's news. Man, we have the information. We have the information superhighway now, and there's no more Soviet Union. But like they're both sort of doing some version of that, right? But like ultimately, the boring truth is that we do still live in a society that is thoroughly defined by all of the old capitalist economic hierarchies, and that the sort of core issues really are about distribution of resources and power, and whether it's sort of technocratic or pseudo-populist, when you say, oh no, all of these old ideological, distinctions have broken down, and, new alliances have emerged because we're really talking about new issues. It's like, yeah, at the end of the day, you're all of these things, right? All of the neither left nor right pitches end up being extremely right-wing in practice, right? Like, whether it's the sort of, Clintonite, sort of socially liberal, graded on a curve for the 1990s, but extremely economically right-wing version, or the Bannonite version, which is just it's just conservatism. I mean, that, like, I always encourage anybody who's confused about this to go check out a debate that Steve Bannon did back in like 2020. I think it was before the pandemic, but I think it was like the first couple months of 2020. Maybe at the end of 2019, he did this debate with David Frum, who of course is a never Trumper Republican, who is
curried a lot of favor over the last 8 years being a never Trumper Republican.
Totally, right? I mean, a million.
He's the favorite of kind of like a certain liberal Democrat that really points to this, to a person like David Frum, and says, see, this is what we mean by orange man bad. Even the people on his team don't like him. Exactly,
yeah. I mean, look, a million resistance liberal ants, and wine moms have forwarded their nephews like David Frum articles about Trump, a very proven way. I mean, the man's gone from being the author of George W. Bush's Axis of Evil speech to true fact, to being totally rehabilitated by liberal America. But it's fascinating to me, if you watch that Bannon Frum debate in Toronto, the Monk debate in late 2019, early 2020. Look, Frum throws a lot of rhetoric about Bannon, being a fascist, and Bannon throws a lot of, populist rhetoric about salt of the earth deplorables at Frum. But at the end of the day, it's amazing how little time they spent arguing about policy in that debate. Like none, basically. And as I was watching it, it occurred to me, it's like, oh, right, because they're both Republicans. Like, at the end of the day, they want the same stuff.
That's very true. Moving on. Damn it. Sorry. I'm
All
trying
good.
to find these questions. How do identity politics play into the formation and appeal of these doppelganger movements? And why do you think there is a tendency for some of these groups to lean heavily into contrarianism as part of their identity?
Yeah. So I think that the whole issue of identity politics comes up in a small way. It's like mostly around the edges in this book. There are a few points where it really comes to the fore, but it comes up in a small way, even in the dedication, right? So it's the dedication is to 3 or 4 people, and one of them is so they're all people who'd like passed away in maybe the year before it came out. So some of them are ones that I'd sort of so 3 of the 4 are Mike Davis, Leo Panich, and Barbara Ehrenreich, and then the 4th is Bell Hooks, and I saw that. I was like, oh, right. That's that's an interesting one to throw into that list, right? That's at least from my perspective, one of these doesn't feel like the other, the others. And I think she says some like there's one point in particular in the book where I think she says something that's sort of to paraphrase Tropic Thunder, you never want to go full identitarian. She really does in one passage, right? I'm sure we'll get to, but there are, there is some of the stuff scattered around the book, and part of the reason I'm making such a big deal of it, right? Because I think you might sort of reasonably say, look, Ben, even if I agree with your critique of some of this stuff, if you look at this massive tome, right, and how relatively little of it is, I think that one's Thomas Friedman, but it was definitely, he and Fromm were definitely on the same page. That, in that it's look, this is such a small part of it, right? Like why make a big deal? But I think it's a really interesting contradiction because, I would argue, I argue in the review that this stuff, really, this stuff really doesn't fit with sort of the best of Klein's politics and the best of the book. And in fact, I would argue that this too, in a lot of ways, is a kind of, diagonal, mirror to the kind of, old time left politics that, that the sort of best parts of the book promote. That, in the same way that you can say about, Wolf and Bannon and Dorr and blah, 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 that these people have this sort of pitch that has left aesthetics in certain ways, but it has this underlying content that's really incompatible with what the left at its best has stood for. I would argue the same thing in this case, that that I think that when you get right down to it, when somebody like Bell Hooks, talks about, how all the ills of our society are caused by, I had to look this up because I knew I wasn't going to remember all this, the imperialist, supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. One of her favorite phrases. I have to think, it's like, look, that the inclusion of the word capitalist in there gives the whole thing kind of a radical edge, right? That, this isn't just liberalism, we're doing something, we're doing something that's really radical. But I gotta say, in all that, long compound phrase, capitalist kind of feels like an afterthought to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, is that really what gets you most hot and bothered? It doesn't sound like it. And the rest of that stuff, I think, is just sort of taken from, liberalism, where when I say liberalism, I don't mean like, I don't know. I don't mean like what our friend Matt McManus might mean about sort of certain basic philosophical premises about, equality, or, everybody having certain rights or civil liberties being important. All that's good stuff. Let's take that as read, right? But what I mean is liberalism in the contemporary American context, this kind of identity liberalism that is very powerful, of course, the Democratic Party. Think white women for Harris, and really, certainly certain kinds of campus activism, for example, and really is just very pervasive in spaces like academia, certainly spaces like any kind of liberal or vaguely left of center media institution, damn near, that like all of these kinds of institutions that I'm talking about will sort of, the last few years, like they'll all kind of have these, weird periodic crises where, I don't know, somebody said something vaguely problematic and the staff room is in revolt, and to pacify everybody, they have to, they have to appoint, a new executive vice president for, inclusion, and, have 3 new trainings and, stuff like that. Right. Like, I think we're all kind of familiar with the script as it constantly plays out in those kinds of places. And I think if you really think about what that worldview is and what it says, like what its analysis of injustice is, right? What its analysis is of what's wrong with the world as it currently exists, and what its prescription is for changing it. I think both the analysis and the prescription are really, very much at odds, right, with with the traditional left program, right? That because look, I mean, what has the left always said? That, and when I say this, by the way, I don't. Sometimes I think, because part of the problem with this is that people often get a few different distinct subjects mixed up. I think in a certain way they're trained to get these things mixed up by the way these terms are thrown around. And if anybody is hearing this as me saying that, like, I don't know, racism or sexism has ceased to exist, or these aren't problems in the world, then you're not listening very closely, right? That's not a thing, I think, right? I think that, like, I think obviously, all of those prejudices exist and are damaging, and, et cetera. If being an anti-racist means that, like, you don't use racial slurs or tolerate other people using them in your presence, then obviously that's a good thing. But I think that the sort of analysis that you get in this worldview at a structural level, and in fact, one of my big beefs with these people is that they use the word structure in sort of a nonsensical way. That, like, you make everything sounds more theoretically robust if you put the word structural or systemic before it, right? Mm-hmm. Even if you're talking about culture and ideology, you can say,
yeah.
Oh, well, actually, this is a structural position, right? And then, like, you explain what you mean by structural position. It's just all culture and ideology shit. Like, it's a really depressing word game. But yeah, what the analysis of what's wrong with the world tends to divide up the population into certain kinds of collective entities white people, black people, men, women, that are postulated to have these kinds of collective interests that are that are sort of innately in conflict with each other, right? So the ultimate, I don't want to spend too much time on this part because I'm not saying anything that anybody watches the show doesn't already know. This is the show that spent so much time talking about this stuff. They sell Anglo-pessimism shirts, right?
Bestseller, by the way.
but like, think about the thing that's being mocked by that, right? That the sort of Afro-pessimist premise that like, oh, there's this thing called white supremacy that, is what was sort of causally at work in creating the conditions of 1619 and 1776 and 1860 and 1995 and 2024. And,
the entire globe is anti-black. Literally, the entire globe is anti-black, and anything close to blackness is hated. It's all anti-blackness.
Yes. If
it's all about your physical blackness.
Yeah. If
so Lena Horne doesn't have to suffer from anti-blackness. she's fine. She's fine.
To tweak a line that I've often heard you use in the other direction. I've been white for a long time, and I've heard a few people say fucked up things about race over the course of my life, but I've never once heard anybody end one of those things with except for the light skinned ones. They're all right.
Yeah. I sure do hate niggers, but there's some cute lighter ones that I like that are okay because I can take them home and maybe fool my friends a little bit and say that she's Italian. and I brought this up. I don't remember if this was the Champagne Room or on a regular show. I brought this up in a car full of, let's say, white passing people, right? Me, you, Jean Bajlan, and a woman I was dating at the time. We went to a wedding in Canada, and while crossing the border, I was a victim of Afro-pessimism. I got into a fight with a border guard, and
not physically, although I did worry.
I was ready to get out of the car. I was so ready to get out of the car. Fuck you, fascist Jack. None of the white people used their privilege to protect me.
I know,
and I don't think their privilege would have protected me. I think they would have got the same anal cavity search as me.
Yeah. No, I think Koopa maybe could have pulled that off best out of any of us. That he could have leaned over, for the passenger seat. Excuse me, sir. I'm a white man, so I would like, if it's all right, I'll just extend my pass to these people, and we can keep going. Yeah. No. So that's the view, and notice that when people say that, right, that because many things have changed since the 1600s, right? There's society we live in is very different. Hot take, right? But the thing that's supposed to be continuous between all of these things is that, like, white people as a collective interest group are imposing their will on black people and perhaps to some extent other groups as collective interest groups. And which is really very, very much the opposite of the sort of traditional left take on racism, racial oppression, because the sort of traditional view about this on certainly the socialist left was that actually like white people in the South, were being sold fool's gold, right? That's like, yeah, maybe racism offers a vicarious sense of identification with people with actual power, but that doesn't give you any power. And in fact, their material interests would be served by aligning themselves with the non-white part of the working class. Whereas on this view, it's like, look, it certainly sounds like, when I hear these people talk, it certainly sounds like they're saying, no, Jim Crow wasn't. Exactly. Jim Crow, wasn't something that like was, used to divide and conquer, the working class. It was actually in the interests of, white people in general. And that's why we have, mass incarceration today. That's why we have, take your pick, right? And the thing that's really striking to me about this is, you'll listen to this later on the podcast.
I'm letting you talk. Go ahead. Finish
No. If you're, apologize.
Don't look on the screen now. If you're gonna.
Awesome.
I'm so sorry because you're over here having this really clippable moment, and I'm just thinking I want to clip this, but I also want to make sure when I clip it that is on the screen. But
fair enough. Yeah, I mean, but it's like, look, this view postulates what sounds to me like this eternal and really unresolvable conflict between these collective interest groups, right? So it's like, look, don't get me wrong, all politics involves conflict, like any political analysis involves some kind of, assignment of friends and enemies, of course, right? But there is a fundamental difference here, that if you're talking about workers and capitalists, there is an endpoint to that, right? There's, if we take away the capitalist property, they're not capitalists anymore, and society is no longer divided between workers and capitalists. Whereas on this kind of view that we're talking about, and I've been framing it in terms of race because I think that's maybe the most sort of rhetorically powerful version of this. It's maybe the dominant version, last few years especially. But we could tell similar stories about any of the other poles of identity, right? About gender, sexuality, disability, any of that stuff. That if you sort of see things through this prism, that any kind of disproportionality and who gets what is a symptom of one of these sort of big collective entities that imposing its will on the other ones, then it's really unclear how that would ever end. Because look, you could achieve perfect demographic representation, but which often seems to be the implicit goal, and this is so we have exactly the right proportions of which members of each group sit on the board of Lockheed Martin, and exactly proportional representation of who goes to a school with a metal detector at the entrance, and all of that stuff, which is good job, guys, sounds like utopia to me. But but like, even so, that's fragile, right? It's like, look, what if the next year you fall out of perfect proportionality, right? Isn't that, isn't what you're describing really just kind of this this stasis, this sort of balance of forces, like people would talk about in geopolitics, right? The balance of power, internationally. So there's no real endpoint here, which also means that your sort of eternal pitch to people who are in the oppressor groups is that it's like, look, there's no point where we're just going to be done, right? Like, you just, you are at best going to be in this ally role where where you're sort of constantly on moral probation. So, to me, the most absurd example of this in the book was when Naomi Klein refers to herself as a settler in Canada, even though she's not even descended from settlers. I mean, her parents came to Canada to avoid the draft in the Vietnam War. But she refers to herself as a settler and says, "Oh, settlers like me need to learn to be better guests and neighbors in this land." So it's like, no, well, okay. So if everybody who has the wrong DNA is just this sort of permanent, they're a guest, right, who has to mind their P's and Q's, like, aside from the sort of absurdity of that as a normative proposition, I think just in principle, that's a silly way to go through life and to see things. It's just so deeply unappealing. I mean, this is like, you want to know why, what we're selling is, less attractive to some gettable people than what, the Wolfs and Bannons and Doors and whatnot are selling. Look at this. I mean, I think that a taste for self-mortification is pretty rare. And generally speaking, the people who are really into that are people who have it pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah, that tends to be the case. There's not a lot of broke-ass people that want to get flogged.
I mean, look, not that there's anything wrong with that if that's what you're into. I'm not.
They're not paying for someone to step on their nuts.
I'm not kick shaming here, Although honestly, I have more respect for paying somebody to literally step on your nuts than to do this sort of weird esoteric version where you pay Sarah Rao like $1,000 to tell you you're a piece of shit at dinner.
I'd rather someone call me a piece of shit than step on my nuts. I'd rather you pay for that. Like, if you're gonna pay for some horrible shit, you want to get me a present. My birthday's coming up. We're probably gonna go out, and I don't want you to be like, "Hey, Jay, I got someone to step on your nuts." Have her call me the N-word. That would have been way worse, like better. I would be mad at you, but I wouldn't have a hole in my sack. I wouldn't have to duct tape my nut sack to keep one of my testes from falling out.
Like, Jason, why do you go through with that? You had to tape up your. Oh man, he was a president. I didn't want to be rude.
I didn't want to be rude. It was the thought. It was the thought. I didn't know what she was doing, and she took out that spiked high heel, and the rest is history. Now you know.
At that point, it would have just been awkward to like say no, stop.
And then I yell at her before she steps on me.
Because I nut quick.
Right there.
Awesome.
We won't be live streaming my birthday party now. We're here in the red light district of TJ. Ben, why are you smiling?
I just can't wait for Jason to open my present. Oh, yeah.
What were we talking about?
I'm just trying to imagine, like finding some like nice Mexican girl, one of those places, and like tried to explain what I wanted her to do. Like, are you sure?
All of a sudden, all the girls start running to you because they can't wait to step on somebody's nuts. They start getting a dance routine ready. Yeah, I'm not leaving now for my birthday. I don't. Whatever you and David have planned sound real diabolical. Lady Braga says middle school boys. You goddamn right.
Yeah, fair.
You are goddamn right.
Yeah.
47 in 2 weeks, and I'm still 12 years old in my mind.
Yeah. 47 going on 11. I'm fine with it.
Yeah, I'm totally fine. What responsibility, let's end with this. We've been going
Sure.
on for an hour, and in some of that hour, we actually were serious. What responsibility do intellectuals and thought leaders have in addressing the rise of these mirror world movements? And how can leftist thinkers and activists better communicate their ideas to prevent co-optation by these doppelgangers? And your opinion?
Yeah. So I think that, I think that it is important to be clear on the differences in both cases, that, between certainly what we want and what, like, right-wing pseudo-populist types want, in that front of the ideological war, and also between what we want and, and what, and what the kind of people who have been criticizing here want. And, I think that the real sort of, in a certain sense, right, I mean, like the real diagonalism comes from people who have, accept some like really outright leftist, not just liberal principles, but sort of want to find some way of mixing and matching with these things that doesn't really make sense. So I think when it comes to the kind of mirror world that Naomi Klein is exploring in the book, which I really do want to circle back to one of the first things I said and say that it actually is a good book. I mean, like I have, I know a pretty, harsh critique of certain things that she says, right? But, it's, that doesn't mean that it's a bad book. I actually think it's a book that's very much worth your time overall. There are just certain things to, to sort of have a critical eye out for. But, when it comes to people who, come from these kind of, have this sort of left terminology, who want to combine it with the kind of mirror world she's talking about, oftentimes that ends up in sort of silly and clownish places, think MAGA communism. But then when people want to combine it with, combine it with this kind of identitarian liberalism, which I would argue is ultimately this kind of managerial, professional class liberalism. I don't think the two are really disentangleable. I don't, I don't actually think the problem is elite capture. I think that the idea that there was some good, that there was like the original good identity
the original Booker T platform was like, that was already captured there, Broham.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I think people who try to combine those things, it doesn't register as clownish the way that like MAGA communism does, because we're all so used to it. And I think that there are sort of some sociologically not mysterious reasons why we're all kind of used to it. And I don't want to end this on too much of a downer, but like, I think that part of the problem is that there isn't really a sort of robust left that's rooted in an organized working class that has its own institutions in a way that, I mean, they're like, we had flashes of at certain points in American history, with, certainly if you go back to, I don't know, the Wobblies or the Socialist Party of America, the Debs era, or, like the CIO in the 30s and socialists and communists, who are doing things then that could exert its own kind of gravitational pull, right? Like, you actually had people who were sort of coming from being liberals who were like fellow travelers and kind of, get into the pull of that. And we just don't have anything like that right now. Not really. Like, and I'm not saying this to shit on anything that anybody is doing. You know, I think that, you know, I think that people do the best that they can with what they have. I'm just trying to be real about the objective situation that, you know, that we certainly don't have an organized working class in the United States. You know, there's like well under a 7% rate of private sector unionization. The organization that currently exists isn't particularly radical. There's you know, there's no sort of robust lefty institutional culture for you know, people to sort of gravitate around, right? Like, I mean, you know, I write for Jacobin. I guess that's about the closest we got, right? You know, but I'm gonna, you know, air some dirty laundry in public here and reveal the shocking truth that, you know, I would not be able to pay my rent just on that, right? You know, so
you'll be stepping on testicles. You'll be exactly. Burgis have those short shorts on.
Yeah, a lot of people.
Money ain't what you think it is, fellas.
Yeah, exactly. Right. You still got to do your testicle stepping on the side. Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe Mexican rent, but then there's also groceries, and you know,
God forbid trying to eat.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, it's a very different situation than if like you and I had like staff jobs on like the Daily Worker, right? Oh, yeah. You know, in 1937, right? Like, we're just not in that situation, right? We have, and because we're not in that situation, the sort of left such as it exists is one that is often drawn from and often exists in exactly those spaces. Thank you. Where this kind of, you know, identity-based liberalism is the most hegemonic. Academia, you know, media that's not, you know, the now non-existent Daily Worker. And it's real uncomfortable if you are in those spaces to say the kinds of things that I've been saying for the last hour or so. All right. Mm-hmm. You don't get a lot of friends by doing that, because, you know, people, you know, it reads as class reductionism. You know, it's a very awkward stance to take, and you know, which is one of the reasons I'm out here writing for Jacobin, stepping on testicles, you know, instead of doing that stuff. And it's and so, yeah, I think that there's every social incentive to try to split the difference and be like, oh yeah, I know I'm kind of crazy. I want stuff that goes beyond what you do, but like, yeah, no, I totally agree with you on all that stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And you know, it's the coward's way out, right? You know, it's I keep thinking about when Amber Frost was on, and I said something about how I understood that lots of people, you know, we were talking about the infamous DSA convention a few years ago. And I said, look, I get that a lot of people are conflict averse. And Amber was like, does that mean being a pussy? You know, it is what it is. So I think that, you know, I think that it is necessary though to push this kind of critique, and at least kind of hold up the flag for this better kind of left politics. I don't want to exaggerate what that's going to accomplish in the near term, because I also don't think that, you know, I mean, I always joke, right? It's like there's no there's no combination of keys that I can press on Restream that's going to change like the overall alignment of class forces in the U.S. Right? Like these are, these are much bigger problems, and I'm not saying that as a counsel of defeat. Like we should just give up forever, right? Things can and do change, but I think it's healthy to have a realistic sense of the degree of influence that we can or can't exert, right? So it's not like, oh, there's something that there's something that Ben and Jason can do that can like will into existence a organized working class and I don't know, let's give ourselves like an independent socialist party while we're at it, just to as long as we're we're just playing pretend, that we could just will these things into existence like we're making the girl in Weird Science, right? That's
so you stop telling people how we spend the weekend.
You're accused of being middle school boys earlier, so I figured I might as well just lean into it. I think there's a limited amount we could do. These are very long-term projects, but I think you do at least have to be clear on what the project is. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.